Hello, my name is Claire Michkowski, and I'm a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for attending today's program presented by the Department of Military History at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. The Dole Institute would like to hear from you about today's program. Please let us know your feedback by contacting us on social media or via email at doleinstitute@ku.edu. We would like to encourage each of you to consider becoming friends of the Dole Institute. Please contact us if you are interested. After the presentation, we will have time for audience members to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able and ask just one brief question. If you enjoy our Fort Leavenworth program, we invite you to join us for Vietnam, Three Who Served on September 21st at 3 p.m. Our guest speaker, Matt Keenan, will share the unique stories of 3 local Vietnam combat veterans, John Gersel, John Solbach, and Norm Fretwell. You can find more information about this event on today's program. Before we begin, I would like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. Now, please join me in welcoming the Professor and Director of the Department of Military History at Fort Leavenworth, Dr. Tom Hansen.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us on this beautiful day. Now, having just recently moved from Hawaii, I can honestly say that for at least today only, Honolulu's got nothing on central Kansas. So enjoy it while it lasts. You're in for a treat. For today's guest speaker is a former Army officer who was wounded overseas and then took advantage of a short-lived program to come and get his PhD here at KU and then serve as an instructor for the Army in the Military History Department at Fort Leavenworth. Gates Brown is a tremendous scholar. He's been with the department now for a number of years. His book is coming out next year from McFarland Press. It's on President Eisenhower's deployment of missiles to Europe. So if you're a Cold War fan, I think that'll be one that you'll be very much interested in. And now today's presentation is on somebody who, looking around, I probably don't need to introduce him to you because you're all smart enough to know who Giulio Douhet is, correct? Make me feel good to say yes. All right, he's one of 2 or 3 of the most important air power theorists of the early 20th century. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Gates Brown.
Thank you, Dr. Hansen. So one of the things that you have to address when you're talking about Douhet, first of all, is his theory advocates directly targeting civilians with a mixture of high explosive ordnance, incendiary bombs, and chemical weapons. So why aren't we talking about someone who advocates possible war crimes as one of the foundational air power theorists? What we're going to explore is a broader context that Douhet is operating in. What are the problems that he's trying to solve? How come his ideas make sense relative to the carnage of World War I? And what are the implications and influences of his ideas? How do they survive World War II? How do they operate in the atomic era? And then how do they still influence air power today? To do that, we're going to talk about 2 big trends that are going on throughout the 19th century. And that is the impact of nationalism and industrialization. What that's going to do to warfare is expand the scale of armies and also improve and increase the resilience of states to continue to fight. We'll talk about how the nascent technology of aviation in the early 20th century doesn't provide a clear path forward. There are some folks that want dirigibles or lighter than air aircraft as the path for aviation, and others want heavier than air aircraft. And it's not real clear which side carries the day until you get to the 1920s. We'll discuss what's going on in World War I that really shapes Douhet's ideas. How does he see aviation as the tool that's going to solve the problems of the trenches and also the tool that's going to solve the problem of industrialized warfare? We'll talk about Douhet's theory. We won't talk much about the evolution of it. We'll discuss his book, Command of the Air, mainly the 2nd edition. that comes out in 1927. That's really the mature form of his ideas. We'll talk about why those ideas resonate so well with air power advocates in the United States, and we'll discuss how this influences the strategic bombing campaign in World War II, as well as aircraft design. And then we'll take it into the atomic era and discuss how these ideas, some folks think, really find their relevance and find their final opportunity with atomic weapons, even though they didn't quite work out with conventional weapons. And then we'll end with some question and answer. One of the things that happens throughout the 19th century is people become more engaged, not only politically, but also with the affairs of state in terms of military policy. And we tie this back to the French Revolution, but by the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, you have representative bodies in most major European states. You have an incredible increase in the amount of troops that are fighting. So Napoleon is taking over 500,000 troops in the Grand Armée. But by the end of the 19th century, you've got millions of troops on both sides. And what this does is it shapes the debate of who's a viable target. Because if the people have some buy-in, some part of the state's policy, and their support provides legitimacy for the government, then they're also, in a sense, consenting to the wars that that state fights, and especially if it's a nationalized war. So if they're providing their consent and they're taking part in a limited way or in a more active role as a soldier in this war, then maybe a better way to fight is not fight the folks that are prepared to make the sacrifices that war calls for, but to actively target the civilian base. Because if you can erode support for a war effort without having to fight the enemy forces, then you might be able to avoid a long-term attritional campaign. The problem is, in the 19th century, you don't really have a good way to directly target the civilian support structure. But aviation is going to provide that. We see the increased destruction of warfare with this expansion of nationalism. You can get millions of people to fight for you, but nationalism doesn't really solve all the problems of bringing people to fight. You can get them to rush forth to defend the colors, but how do you go about providing the supplies, providing the weapons, providing the munitions? Industrialization answers that. So nationalism gives you the capability to put millions of people in the field. And industrialization provides you the capability to supply them with rifles, to supply them with cannon, and the millions of rounds of ammunition that it takes to wage a war. But it's also going to provide you the capability to move them rapidly across a country. So what would have taken a matter of days or weeks, now you can do in hours or days. And so you have a much more resilient ability to fight a war. And we'll see how this is going to influence the battlefield in 1914. Douhet grows up in an era of unification. We see two folks here that are really important in their individual nation's unification. On the left, you've got Wilhelm, Kaiser Wilhelm, and he's going to be the leader of United Germany. And then on the right, you have Garibaldi, who is a revolutionary hero that fights to unify Italy. Douhet is born in 1869, which is a couple years before you have Italian unification. His family is from the Piedmont region, and his father serves the House of Savoy. They're Italian nationalists, and the House of Savoy is going to be the ruling family of a unified Italy. So Douhet is coming of age in this era of Italian nationalism, and he's trying to understand how can Italy take its rightful place at the forefront of European power. because he doesn't want Italy to be a second-rate nation. He thinks that it deserves to be a great nation, but there are some problems. Because Italy doesn't have the natural resources that Germany has. It doesn't have the industrial base that Britain has. It doesn't have the manpower base that Russia has. And so Douhet looks to technology as a way to overcome some of these imbalances. Technology can provide a way to maximize the resources that Italy has. He joins the Army in 1888 after he goes to the Italian Army's Artillery Academy. He graduates #1 in his class, and then after his time in the Artillery Academy, he goes to the Polytechnic in Turin to study electrical engineering. So Douhet is not only a military practitioner, he also understands the technical aspects of not only electrical theory, but as he starts to get more involved with aviation, he really understands the technical side of aviation as well. In 1900, he's promoted to captain, and he joins the Italian Army's General Staff. When he learns about aviation around 1908, it completely changes his ideas. Because prior to that, he looked at the internal combustion engine and automobiles as a way that Italy would be able to maximize technology. It would allow for more effective transportation on the battlefield, it would improve logistics, but air power completely overwhelms any attachment that he had to the automobile. Because he sees in air power a way not only to make warfare more efficient, but you also provide ways to overcome some of the manpower imbalances. And we'll see how this helps him understand how to solve the problem of the trenches. Douhet early on starts to write, and he writes a lot of criticisms about military operations, but he also writes about the adaptation and adoption of technology to military means. He comes up with a framework that has 4 steps. And he says, when you ever have a new technology, the first thing that you're going to do is adapt that technology to military uses. So with an automobile, you put armor on it, you make it work on the battlefield. With a plane, you're going to figure out how to put munitions on it or how to use it for reconnaissance. And then the next step is advocates are going to latch onto it and they're going to exaggerate the capabilities of this new technology. And this exaggeration is going to eventually lead to disillusionment because the advocates are going to overpromise and underdeliver. And then the final stage is a return to reality where you have a more effective incorporation of this new technology into warfare. I'll leave it to you to decide which stage Douhet is in, if he's a guy that's overpromising for what air power can actually deliver, or if you think that Douhet is really at the final stage and he's returning to reality and providing a theory that is a viable way to use air power. Douhet starts to work in the aviation section, and there's a debate going on in the Italian Army about how best do you take the limited resources that Italy has and invest it in this new technology. Some folks want to invest in dirigibles or lighter-than-air aircraft. They think that this will provide a much more stable platform for reconnaissance. They think it'll be more fuel efficient. They think it'll be better because it has longer time on station compared to an airplane. Douhet is not sold on this because for Douhet, he realizes that if he were in a dirigible conducting a reconnaissance operation and he saw an enemy aircraft, well, he'd do what any soldier would want to do, and that is find a way to start firing or fighting. And a blimp or a dirigible just doesn't have the agility, it doesn't have really the capability for aerial combat. So Douhet advocates for airplanes, even though there are some drawbacks in terms of what they can do with reconnaissance. He takes part in the General Staff's wargaming in 1911, trying to figure out how do you incorporate this new technology. And the result of the war games actually backs dirigibles. Luckily, though, Italy doesn't have to wait too long to see what happens when you use air power in the battlefield. Italy invades Libya in 1912, and they take blimps and they take aircraft. The advocates look at this and they want to talk about how effective bombing was at eroding and collapsing Ottoman forces' morale. Some of the skeptics, though, argue that air power doesn't overwhelm the enemy. It doesn't preclude the need for a ground invasion. Maybe it can help ground operations, but it doesn't really change things that much. Well, the advocates have an answer for that. And the answer is, well, that the Ottomans, because they didn't fight in a conventional way, because they wanted to use troops that were more dispersed, they wanted to use guerrilla tactics, they didn't provide the condensed troop targets that air power would really be effective at taking on. Or because Libya lacked an industrial sector or large urban populations, that there weren't many strategic targets, and that's why air power couldn't do as well as it would against a more modern or developed enemy. And we'll see air power advocates make similar arguments to criticisms in World War II, that while this campaign is not the best example, or because you didn't use Douhet's theory exactly as he articulated it, you can't really invalidate it. So that argument still goes on today. Air power advocates arguing that air power, as Douhet defines it, has never really been given the chance that it needs to show it can be a war-winning capability. While the skeptics argue there's been many opportunities and it continues to show that it's not quite ready for prime time. Douhet gets a chance to command an aviation battalion. And this is kind of the state of aviation. You can see that this is an Italian bomber plane, but it's wooden and cloth construction. It's not what we see as a modern bomber, and it's definitely not what you'll see in the 1930s or the 1940s. This is what Douhet's thinking of when he's talking about what air power can do prior to World War I. And this is not too much removed when he's thinking about what air power is going to do in the early 1920s. When he's got command of this aviation battalion, Douhet doesn't step back from criticizing the Italian army or making recommendations for what the Italian army needs to do. And so he's vocal both in writing as well as in speaking. And this frustrates his superiors because Douhet just won't keep quiet, kind of similar to Billy Mitchell. He's got great ideas, but the way that he articulates them makes his superiors a little frustrated. Also, Douhet goes about acquiring some new bombers in an unorthodox manner. There's a tri-engine plane that an aviation manufacturing company is producing, and Douhet sees that these will provide more range and more capability. But he doesn't want to go through the bureaucratic hassle of getting a purchase order and doing things through the government, and so he obligates the Italian army to buy 50 of these planes without authorization. That, combined with his outspokenness, leads to him losing command of this aviation battalion. So when World War I begins, Douhet is not in any sense associated with Italy's air forces. He's a chief of staff of an infantry division. And Douhet is going to continue to have problems whenever he's got the opportunity to make real changes with his ideas. The internal resistance that he faces or working within the system really frustrates him because he wants change and he wants it now, but systems rarely change that quickly. We've talked about the importance of nationalization. We've talked about the importance of industrialization. And those two things come together in World War I to give the defense an asymmetric advantage. You've got long-range artillery that can fire over the horizon. The problem is you need to contain a larger explosion to have a long range, which means you need a heavier cannon. Well, things that are very heavy and aren't self-propelled tend to stay where you put them. So artillery can do wonders in terms of supporting limited advances, but they're not mobile in the way that we think of artillery today. So they're really good in the defense. They're okay in supporting limited advances of infantry. You also have a machine gun. When we think about a machine gun today, we think of Rambo, and he's got an M60, and he's holding it with one hand and his belt of ammunition in the other hand, and he can fire it all by himself. But that's not a machine gun that we're talking about in World War I. This weapon weighs 100 pounds, not including the water it takes to cool the barrel, not including the ammunition. So it's not something that you can quickly move as your frontline trace of troops advances. Again, they're okay in terms of supporting a limited assault, and they're really good in the defense. So ground warfare starts to struggle. You've got the stalemate of the trenches on the Western Front. And Douhet looks at this, and he sees that air power, if effectively used, he argues, can bypass this problem. Because you don't really have to fight the forces in the trench line. You can go over them. You can bomb rear areas. You can bomb lines of communication. You can bomb headquarters. In World War I, Douhet argues that the Allied forces, really the Entente forces, really need to create a combined air armada and target these rear areas. This is not the Douhet that's going to argue for bombing population centers. In fact, he wants to outlaw that. And ideally, he'd want to outlaw warfare and use this combined air fleet to quickly end any upstart campaigns. So Douhet, before World War I and before Italy joins World War I, is a little bit of a utopian in terms of his view of what air power can do. We'll see that's going to change when we get to command of the air in the late 1920s. But this is the problem that Douhet is trying to solve with air power. If this is what war looks like, this long attritional struggle that's going to be mired in trench warfare, then you have to have some way to get past it. And Douhet is not arguing that air power is going to eliminate the destruction of warfare. But he at least hopes that it's going to concentrate it. So maybe you don't have to sacrifice a generation in the trenches. Maybe you sacrifice some population centers. Maybe you don't have to fight a war for years. You just concentrate the destruction chronologically in terms of days or weeks. Douhet is not saying that you can get through war without some death. He's just trying to not fight in a trench war that goes on for years and years, and the progress is measured in meters. Douhet's experience in World War I is a little odd. He spends a year in prison, and again, his pen gets him into trouble. He sees that the Italian army is struggling and not set up to fight the war that it's faced with. He thinks that the leadership is not prepared, that there are problems with the equipment that the troops are fighting with, and with the general disposition of the Italian army. So he writes a memo to an Italian member of parliament, outlining his concerns and providing some recommendations for change. The member of parliament loses the letter on a train, and it's found by a good citizen who turns it over to the relevant authorities, but it's a classified memo with Douhet's name on it. So Douhet gets charged with leaking classified information. And he spends a year in prison. He gets out in 1917, right before the Battle of Caporetto, which is the Italian army's worst defeat in World War I. And it largely validates the claims that Douhet made. He'll have to wait until 1920 for legal justification or to clear his name legally. But he doesn't leave the army. When he gets out of jail, he's not cashiered from service. He continues in service in the Italian army. And he's going to continue to write, because Douhet is nothing if not determined. And we talk about Command of the Air. That's the book that most folks know about when we talk about Douhet. It comes out in 2 editions. And the first edition is released in 1921. And he kind of pulls some punches, because Douhet is hoping to get support from the Army and from the Navy. And so he's not arguing that those services are irrelevant or that those services are not as important. In the first edition of Command of the Air, he's really arguing that air power can help the Army fight more effectively, that it can help the Navy wage war more effectively. That pretense is gone in the 1927 edition of Command of the Air. In fact, in his introduction, he talks about why he had to pull the punches and why he's very happy in the second edition to finally give his ideas the full airing that they deserve. So we'll talk a little bit about what his ideas are. What is Command of the Air? How do you go about achieving it? What does it do for you? And then we'll talk about how this leads into his recommendation of what type of Air Force to build, what type of planes you need, and we'll discuss how this influences the United States Army Air Corps and air power advocates in the United States when they're trying to find a way to justify how to use air power most effectively, and why Douhet's ideas provide a solid intellectual foundation. I outlined at the beginning the basics of his theory. You take three types of munitions: high explosives, incendiary bombs, and chemical weapons, and you pummel population centers until one of two things happen. Either the people demand a change in policy from their government, or if the government resists change, the people will overthrow the government. Because Douhet doesn't think that people are capable of accepting the sacrifices that this will require. He outlines why he thinks these three types of munitions will work really well together. High explosives will create a lot of rubble. It will destroy buildings. It will force people from any shelter that they have. Incendiary bombs will create fires and further increase the chaos. And then chemical weapons will not only kill the people that are forced to go outside, but it will also preclude anyone from coming to help the folks that are injured and still alive. And you continue to use this mix of high explosives, incendiary, and chemical weapons over and over and over again until you finally have your war aim. And Douhet doesn't think this will last months. It definitely won't last years. Douhet argues that if you prosecute air war in the way that he outlines it, that you're going to have victory in a matter of days. At the outside, weeks. But how do you get command of the air? And how do you make sure that the enemy's not reading the same book you are? Well, Douhet doesn't advocate for air-to-air combat. This is one of the fascinating changes. We discussed how he supported heavier-than-air aircraft because he felt like they would be more effective in air-to-air combat. But by 1927, air-to-air combat is not really on Douhet's radar. And the reason for that is largely there is no radar. How do you go about finding the enemy in the air? You have to see him. And if you can see him, you're pretty close to him, which means if you're trying to fight a defensive war, the enemy is going to be pretty close to the target that you're trying to protect. So what Douhet advocates is you destroy the nest. When you talk about nest, he means airfields. If you destroy the airfields, yeah, the enemy can get off an opening salvo. But the enemy can't land its air forces. It can't refit. It can't repair. It can't launch a second strike. So the worst you'd have to endure is an opening strike. And if you can get that, then your air fleet is destroying the enemy airfields. And once the enemy airfields are gone, you have command of the air. And he talks about command of the air in a similar way that Mahan talks about command of the sea. And that is, if you have it, you can fly when you want, where you want, and do what you want in the air. It's not something that's more localized like Corbett's view of command of the sea, but it's also in relation to your enemy. Whereas Mahan's talking about command of the sea, really when Douhet is talking about command of the air, he's talking about your ability to overfly an enemy state, not that you have the capability to prevent all powers from flying, but just the enemy that you're fighting. And he says, if you have command of the air, then victory is a foregone conclusion. If you don't have command of the air, then you will lose. And this is Douhet starting to set the bar pretty high for what air power can do. Because in his second edition, he argues that air power is the war-winning capability. Not only does it allow you to get past fighting trench warfare, but it also is going to, in some ways, make trench warfare irrelevant. Because while your enemy is trying to dig trenches, trying to invade your country, you're bombing his cities. You're bombing his capital. So we've talked about how to get command of the air. What type of air force do you need to get this accomplished? Douhet doesn't really advocate for a wide range of airframes. You know, Billy Mitchell talks about you want everything. You want pursuit fighters, you want fighter aircraft, you want bombers, you want civilian aviation. If it flies, you want it. Douhet is much more focused because for him, an air war is an offensive form of warfare. There really is no defense, and we'll talk about why that is in a little bit. But the plane that you need, he talks about it being a battle plane, that it would carry its own defense with it. And technology is part of the reason why. In the early 1920s, when he's writing, if you want to have a plane that can keep up with a bomber in terms of speed and range, it's going to need to look a little bit like a bomber. Bombers are a little bit like the Army's helicopter fleet. The Chinook is the fastest helicopter that the Army has. It looks ungainly, but it's fast. Bombers are the fastest thing flying in the 1920s in terms of speed and range. They have multiple engines. So if you're going to create an escort fighter, it's going to have multiple engines just so it can keep up, which means it's going to need to have fuel for multiple engines, which means it's going to look an awful lot like a bomber. And if you're going to build something that looks like a bomber, you may as well put bombs on it, so when it's over the target, it can drop some bombs. So for Douhet, this idea of escort fighters just doesn't make sense. It's like a unicorn. It'd be nice if they existed, but they're impossible. But if you have a battle plane that has defensive armaments, if you fly them in the correct formation, enemy fighters won't get close. You could have both an offensive and defensive plane. So when he talks about the makeup of an air fleet, it's overwhelmingly bombers with some limited number of reconnaissance aircraft. He doesn't talk about pursuit aircraft because if you're going to build pursuit aircraft, and pursuit aircraft are the ones that would stay close to areas you wanted to protect, and on alert, they would fly up and fight the enemy bombers or fight the enemy air fleet. And Douhet entertains that notion, and he discusses that what you'd have to do is figure out how far apart are the different targets you want to protect, because at some point, some would be unable to mutually support each other. And so you have to find out how many bases you would need to create to support those different targets. And then you have to figure out what number of planes, pursuit aircraft, you put at each one of these independent pursuit bases. He says, well, the worst case scenario is that you'd have to take the entire enemy air fleet because the enemy would concentrate all of its assets on one target. So in theory, if you had 10 different pursuit air bases, you'd have to have the same number of expected enemy aircraft at each one of those pursuit air bases. You'd have to build the number of enemy air fleet 10 times over in order to wage an effective defensive campaign. And Douhet argues that this is going to outstrip any type of reasonable defense allocation. So you're better off investing scarce resources in strategic bombers that are going to go and destroy the enemy's capability to launch subsequent air attacks than you are in trying to create a defensive air fleet. The other problem that you have is, again, there's no good way to track enemy air attacks. You have to visually see them, or you can hear them. So maybe you'd have a perimeter of sight stations, observation stations. but they need to be pushed out enough to give you standoff, so that way you'd have enough time to get your pursuit fleet in the air. So if you stand off maybe 10, 20 miles, well, you have to have a radius that's pretty big, and it just doesn't make sense. So Douhet doesn't see defense as a viable way to pursue command of the air. You have to go about it with an offensive mindset. But he does have a role for the Army and the Navy in the second edition of Command of the Air. And that is, those forces need to be able to provide enough defense for the air arm to carry the day, for the air arm to win the war. So you don't need much of an army, because they're just going to be a little bit of a speed bump to let you know the enemy's trying to invade. And while the enemy is massing his forces and advancing on your border, your planes are hitting first their airfields and then their population centers. And before the enemy is able to make any significant inroads in their invasion, their capital is starting to revolt. The people are unable to take the sacrifice that you're imposing on them, and they'll demand a cessation of hostilities. Now you see that Douhet in his second edition of Command of the Air, that's where he really comes out with all guns blazing, and any idea of cooperating with other services is gone. Now when we look at what happens with his ideas, what's the influence of these ideas, you don't have to look very far. He doesn't provide an illustration of what a battle plane looks like in Command of the Air. But if you look at a B-17, that's the idea. The B-17 would carry its own defense. Now, when we're talking about a B-17 fleet, it's not what Douhet is arguing, because Douhet says that really you need 5 aircraft in a bomber unit. This bomber unit would take 10,000 pounds of ordnance, 2,000 pounds each plane, and then they would target an area. There's a circle with a diameter of 500 meters. And once they attacked that target area, it would be destroyed. One shot, one kill. Because Douhet argues that if you use air power effectively, you don't need to re-engage targets with aerial bombing. That bombing is destructive enough that one sortie will do. We can already see that there's going to be a drastic departure, because the U.S. Army Air Corps doesn't send 10 bombers, it doesn't send 5 bombers. It's sending dozens, hundreds of bombers. But these ideas do carry over. Douhet's Command of the Air gets to the Air Corps, the Army Air Corps, in a little bit of a roundabout manner. There's a condensed French translation that's then translated into English, and that's the interwar Air Corps' exposure to Douhet's ideas. But what Douhet offers is a good foundation, because he provides really one of the more rigorous explanations of how you go about applying air power. Where folks like Billy Mitchell are clear on the type of air force that you should build, they're a little bit less specific and especially less precise in how you go about targeting the enemy. And so Douhet outlines where you should target first, and then how you should shift your fire once you've got command of the air. Douhet also is arguing for an independent air force, because he realizes that if air power is not independent, then it might be subordinate to ground forces. And if ground commanders are outlining where the bombers are attacking, then air power is not doing what it should. It's not bombing population centers. It's not eroding the public's support for the war effort. It's helping ground forces destroy enemy ground forces, which from Douhet's perspective gets you back into the problem of the trenches again. The whole reason you built an air force is so you don't have to fight in trenches. So if you're going to be serious about an air war, you can't let your air forces be subordinate to ground forces. In World War II, there is a concerted effort to try to use strategic bombing in a way that is similar to what Douhet is arguing. Now, you don't start off directly bombing population centers, but throughout the course of the war, you do get to a period where you're firebombing cities, both in Europe and in Asia. And so what is the evaluation? Did Douhet's ideas prove valid in World War II? Well, there's great debate. In one sense, you could argue that we never really tried Douhet's ideas because we didn't mix high explosives, incendiary weapons, and chemical weapons together in individual bombing runs. However, when you look at the scale of munitions that Douhet is outlining, 10,000 pounds for that 500-meter diameter circle, and only engaging targets one time. The amount of ordnance dropped in World War II is an order of magnitude greater than Douhet said would be necessary. And the problem is, in World War II, it wasn't just an air campaign. It required a ground invasion. It required naval blockades. It required all the forces fighting. So Douhet's ideas aren't really valid in some sense when we look at World War II. Now, advocates will argue that that's because it's not a good test case, that really there are too many restrictions placed on air power in World War II, and that the real test of Douhet's theory is going to come in the atomic era. But I think there are some other reasons to be a little skeptical about this. And one of those is the lack of appreciation that Douhet had for the emotional component of war. He argued that taking the war directly to the people would quickly collapse their political support for the government and cause that government either to end the war or the people would overthrow the government. But we see in the Battle of Britain that German bombing doesn't decrease the British support for the war. It magnifies it because they start to realize what losing this war would mean. So nationalism cuts both ways. Nationalism does get you the ability to get huge numbers of people to fight, but because it also creates that intimate connection between the people and the government and the people and the state, they become more involved in protecting the state. And so they start to understand that if the state falls, then their way of life might radically change, and they don't want to accept that. So people can put up with a lot more than Douhet thinks they can. Now again, with atomic weapons, advocates argue that this is a completely new realm of warfare, especially when you get into the thermonuclear age. Because you can now destroy a city with one bomb. And then you have intercontinental ballistic missiles. You don't even have to have a bomber fleet to fly over. One missile can destroy a huge city. And maybe that's going to be enough to collapse the will of the people. If you take one city out, that will be over. Luckily, we don't know. But because we don't know, there's just as much of a chance that losing a city might further inflame the people's desire for revenge. It might further steel people to accept even more sacrifices. But outside of atomic warfare, Douhet's ideas still resonate today. They still provide a solid foundation for air power and air power advocates. And one of the reasons why is because Douhet is one of the first theorists to talk about the importance of air power as an independent and war-winning capability. And so air power advocates continue to point to his ideas and continue to say that, well, if we can focus more on air power, then you'll have a shorter campaign. You won't need as much of a ground invasion. And it's obvious why this appeals not only to military leaders, but also to policymakers. Because in a sense, Douhet offers a concentrated war. You don't have to worry about losing a generation. You don't even have to worry about mobilizing millions of your people to fight in a war. All you have to do is marshal your strength projected into enemy territory and start bombing their people, and the war will be over. Now, we don't talk about that today with air power, but there's still an idea that if you hit the right target, whether that's an economic target, whether it's an industrial target, that if you understand the network and you can precisely target it, that you can cripple an enemy's capability to fight, and maybe preclude the need for a long ground campaign, or ideally, any ground campaign at all. And we see some of that idea in 2003 with the shock and awe campaign, that you've got a concentrated bombardment to decapitate Iraqi forces. And the idea is that you can degrade the enemy before you ever fight them. Now, there's a difference between what Douhet's arguing and the shock and awe campaign. And the big difference is, Douhet would argue that if you'd use it correctly, that you don't need a ground invasion. And that's one of the big differences. Air power advocates, especially in the service, have kind of vacillated between being on more Douhetian, saying we don't need the Army at all, to moving back and arguing that air power can be something that really helps the Army, decreases casualties, helps the Army be more effective. But Douhet's ideas are always going to be popular, because Douhet promises a way to focus the destruction on the enemy and prevent generations of your own people dying in the trenches of World War I. All right. Thank you. Questions?
Gates, I would, thank you very much. I would offer for our consideration that Douhet's theories have really, with the exception of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, never been put to a full test. What if, for example, we'd had those devices on 8 December 1941 as compared to September or August 1945? Would that have been a better test of Douhet's theory?
Well, I don't think that even Hiroshima and Nagasaki are good examples either, because there's a long-term naval campaign and ground campaign that prepped the Japanese for the final bombing. Now, if you have atomic weapons before, possibly that's a good test, but I still don't think that you can overwhelm people that easily. I think when faced with that much destruction, there's a likely reaction that they will want even more revenge instead of taking a step back and foregoing war. But I think you're right, that maybe if we'd had atomic weapons at the beginning of World War II, then maybe that would be a case where folks could say, okay, we finally have Douhet's ideas, and we can see if they're valid or not. We just haven't. Luckily, we haven't had that.
Oh, thank you. Would the bombing of Dresden been a miniaturized example of Douhet's theory?
In a sense, right, because it's firebombing. And so you're missing, now the firebombing is incredibly destructive. You're missing the chemical attack in coordination with it. But it is that idea. And so that's one of the things that Douhet is accurate about, that air power can really be destructive. But what we don't see in Germany is large population movements to overthrow the government, even after Dresden. Now, there are attempts to assassinate Hitler, but those are from within the army. And so that's one area where Douhet's arguments don't really bear fruit, is if that was an accurate or an effective test case, then from Douhet's theory, you'd expect to see more public unrest or some demonstrations, and we don't see that. And I think another thing that Douhet doesn't quite take into account is the effectiveness of authoritarian regimes at really tamping down any resistance, even given severe sacrifices. Good question.
Gates, the popularity of Douhet's theories seems to wax and wane over the decades. My question is, if you look at air power theory today, with the advent of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, if Douhet's theory is relevant or has ceased to be relevant?
I think it's always going to be relevant, if nothing else because folks that look for arguments for the sufficiency of air power are going to turn to Douhet. In terms of, are they going to be valid or not? We have to wait until we have a nuclear exchange or a thermonuclear exchange. But I do think that they're always going to be relevant because you're always going to have folks that are trying to make war fit their conception or make war seem to be more convenient than it is. And Douhet provides a pretty, it's not painless for the enemy, but it is relatively painless for the victor if you buy into Douhet's theory.
Gates, one of the ideas that you haven't really discussed is Douhet just flat misses the strength of the defense.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just radars, but the fighters and where they can be, and especially anti-aircraft artillery, which gets developed. So, in his writings, is he as dismissive of that, or does he believe just that the offense will just overwhelm?
No, he's dismissive of anti-aircraft artillery specifically, and also of pursuit aircraft. And largely it's because of the state of technology in the 1920s. You don't have effective radar systems, you don't have effective ways of integrating air defense artillery, and you definitely don't have the effective pursuit aircraft that you'll have even a decade later. And so in that sense, Douhet is kind of a captive of his time when he's talking about the inability to defend. But his ideas, I don't think that they necessarily would have radically changed just because he sees the, in some sense, the overwhelming aspect of the offensive. But he's very dismissive, largely because those tools that you see there are effective in World War II, they're not at that state of readiness or effectiveness in the 1920s.
We jump from World War I to World War II. I'm wondering about the Spanish Civil War, particularly with Italy's involvement. Did his theories have any credence or consideration at that time?
Yeah. Douhet, again, struggles. He serves in the Air Commissariat. He's the general of the Air Division, but he holds that post in 1919 and about 1921. And he doesn't really get to turn his ideas into policy because he doesn't want to work within the bureaucracy. And so he leaves, and he goes to write Command of the Air. And one of the struggles that he has is he doesn't make enough friends inside of the government to really get his ideas enacted. Now, folks will want to point to Douhet as a great theorist, but in terms of actually making an Italian Air Force that looks like Douhet, it never really comes to fruition. And the Italian Air Force, by the time you've got the Spanish Civil War, doesn't look like what Douhet wanted. And they're not really putting his ideas into action.
Is Douhet's theories as his Air Force is first strike?
Yes.
All right. I hesitate to mention it, but today, if some idiot drops a little teeny ballistic missile on a city, then the response has got to be incredible.
Yes.
And so Douhet's done, isn't he? If that response is absolutely incredible?
Well, so if you have an unprovoked act of aggression and the enemy doesn't gain command of the air with the first strike, then your response has to be overwhelming, so you get command of the air in your first strike. And so in that sense, as long as you can absorb the first hit and take command of the air very quickly, then you can win. But I think in your context, how does Douhet work with intercontinental ballistic missiles, especially when you're talking about a state that would have parity with the United States. You really can't talk about absorbing dozens of thermonuclear strikes and having anything to really to call victory, even if you maintain your integrity of a state as a state. If you're talking about something that's a smaller strike, again, if you lose a city, we don't really know what that would look like. Maybe people would collapse and they would demand that we make whatever concessions were required to end the war. Maybe people would want revenge and they would want an overwhelming response. But I don't think that necessarily Douhet would be done, because he would still argue for an overwhelming reaction.
At first glance, it doesn't seem like Douhet's theory entails the counterbalance of allies.
Mm-hmm.
Am I?
Yeah, you're right. He does talk about, prior to World War I and before Italy joins World War I, he does discuss a combined Allied fleet. But in Command of the Air, he doesn't talk about alliances. This is much more one-on-one warfare. And his articulations are always, nation A or state A is fighting against state B, and this is what state A needs to do to get command of the air. He doesn't expand his aperture to discuss, well, what happens if you have the ability to create an alliance. And I think in large part he doesn't want to muddy the waters with adding resiliency to enemy capacity. And if you can overwhelm an enemy that's arbitrarily isolated by getting command of the air, you don't have to worry about enemies' allies helping them to sustain further air attacks.
Gates, great pitch. I think we want to look to theories to be the end all, one size fits all, and I'm not sure that we can ever do that with any theory. But it seems to me that in the wake of the Russo-Japanese War, and in the wake of the trenches and no man's land of 1914 to 1918, the Douhet's theory is pretty charitable. He wants to, because what's happened on the ground side is we've introduced such unbelievable killing machines that just lays waste to humanity. So I would like to make the argument that he's really very humanitarian in what he wants to do, given the context of his time. What do you say to that?
I think that, again, he wants to concentrate the destruction of war. So if nationalized and industrialized war is going to be catastrophic, then if you're going to fight that type of war, maybe you can localize the destruction. Maybe you can shorten the time span of the war. So it's humanitarian in that he's not arguing for an expansion of warfare. It's not quite humanitarian in that he's talking about directly targeting civilians, but I think that his argument would be, I'm going to lessen the overall burden and destruction of war by forcing people to rapidly come to grips with what it means for their state to fight. And if they can understand that sacrifice and they want to make it, okay, we'll continue to pile death and destruction on them. But maybe one of the reasons World War I goes on so long is because it takes so long for the people in Germany to understand what's going on and to understand the sacrifices that they're making. And if you can bring that pain quickly to people, then they'll want a rapid decision. So in that sense, yeah, it's humanitarian, not maybe humanitarian in a traditional definition of the word. Yeah. All right. Okay. Oh, we have. Sorry.
It's hard to listen to this and not bring us up to what's going on today, and each of us are probably thinking how his theory would apply today. I think a key question that was asked earlier was about allies. I can see maybe his theory working, say, in the unlikely event that Russia and China together would ally and then they could possibly have overwhelming force. But otherwise, it certainly would apply, I think, to North Korea alone. But then you'd have China and Russia perhaps allying with North Korea. So I think this allies deal is a big thing,
Yeah.
as to how it would work today.
Yeah, allies are something that definitely would change the dynamic. And unfortunately, he doesn't wrestle with that. Because you're right, depending on if the enemy is completely isolated, then it might be easier to impose your will on them. But if they're supported by allies, you might be hesitant in applying overwhelming force on the enemy. So you're right that allies might make the difference. Okay. Good. Thank you.